Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be doing a movie review, actually a television series review, and we're going to be talking about the series on television cable network called Mrs. America. Mrs. America. It's on Hulu, and I've been watching it, and I think we're into the 7th episode so far. And it's basically a sort of a docudrama of the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment back in the late 70s and early 80s. We're talking about the era where you had the feminists Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug, and you had Betty Friedan and some of the famous feminists. And they were pushing for something called the ERA, which is the Equal Rights Amendment. And what this would basically do is would amend the Constitution of the United States. And it needed ratification, 2/3 of the states' ratification. And it came within like 2 or 3 states of being actually ratified. And then it would go to the Congress, and it would go to the executive branch, the president, and they said that they would all pass it. So this thing came very, very close to passing, and what it would do is basically say that men and women must be treated equal in respect to the law, in every respect. Well, you might think, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, isn't that already the situation here in the United States? Aren't there laws that would, for example, allow women to have equal pay for equal work and equal treatment under the law and so on and so forth? Yes, there are. There are many, many laws, but this thing would be a sweeping equality, and it would basically essentially eliminate sexual differences before the law. And one of the implications of the ERA is that it would allow the U.S. government to draft women into the military. And this is actually something that the feminists of the time, the ERA proponents, actually conceded. Yes, that would mean that women would be drafted alongside the men for military service. And Phyllis Schlafly, who is basically the star of this docudrama, although she's distorted by this docudrama because it's actually created and produced and performed by feminists. We know that the actresses who are starring in this docudrama, we know that the producers that produced it, the executive directors, and so on and so forth, right on up the chain, the networks and everything, are all feminists and don't like what Phyllis Schlafly stood for back 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And so, but they are wanting to produce a docudrama that shows the world what it was really like back when ERA was defeated. It was actually defeated. It didn't meet the standard. It fell 2 or 3 states short. And the reason it was defeated is largely the result of the activity of this woman named Phyllis Schlafly. Now, a lot of people have never heard of Phyllis Schlafly. It's not a household name. And a lot of people never understood that this one woman and her dedication to stopping something that would ultimately lead to destruction and lead to hardship for women in this country. Why is it that the history books don't talk more about Phyllis Schlafly? Why is it that schools don't teach about Phyllis Schlafly? Why is it that television has basically silenced any mention of her in her efforts to defeat ERA? Well, the reason is because most of the people who are in power centers today, the universities and colleges, the education establishment, the media outlets, and you just go on down the line, law schools, government, arts and science, the whole establishment of the power structure in the United States today is leaning secular, and they don't like what Phyllis Schlafly accomplished with her group of women in their defeating this ERA push. And we're seeing the ERA again come up today, even because we see that some people in government, some congresswomen in the heavily Democratic, radically leftist Congress today, with the likes of Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and some of the other radical socialistic people, they're actually talking about pushing for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, because they're saying now that the states that didn't pass it way back 30, 40 years ago, those states now actually would pass it. And so they're trying to say, well, even though the deadline for the ERA bill is through and done, we're going to claim it as having passed, because today now those states would pass it. And so they're trying to basically revisit and rewrite history. And they're trying to do that, the producers are and the actresses are trying to do that with this docudrama. It's basically a feminist hit piece against a woman that they hated with a passion because of her efforts and her successful efforts to derail Equal Rights Amendment, so-called Equal Rights Amendment. And so the reason why nobody knows about Phyllis Schlafly, and the reason why children are not taught about Phyllis Schlafly, and the reason why her name isn't a household name today, is because she did something that the people in power don't like, and that is she defeated, from a grassroots level, she defeated an elitist, secularist legislation, and they want to write her out of history. And so what they want to do now with this docudrama is they want to talk about her, but then they want to rewrite history and distort and demonize her. They want to show her in this documentary as this cold, ruthless, hard-hearted manipulator of women, and someone who opposed something good, and they want to show her as a ambitious political operative of the far right, and they want to just characterize her as someone who's out of touch with the way women think and act. Well, in reality, Phyllis Schlafly actually gave arguments. She wasn't basing her opposition to ERA on emotionalism and scare tactics and fear and trying to whip women up in opposition to it. She was actually giving arguments. She was a great debater. She actually was sharp and knew her facts. So they were trying to, in this docudrama, distort a lot of her work. And for example, in one of the episodes, they showed a debate between her and a feminist lawyer. And it shows in this clip in the docudrama where Phyllis Schlafly supposedly was cornered or caught in trying to invent a court case in order to bring up a point. And this feminist lawyer supposedly caught her on that and made her look stupid on national television. But if you go back into the archives and you actually dig up the footage, it actually was the reverse of that, where Phyllis Schlafly caught the lawyer in making up a court case and made her look bad on national television. But the docudrama took the opposite and creatively and fictitiously made Phyllis Schlafly look bad on television, as if the lawyer had cornered her into a position that she couldn't defend. And so that's an example of what this documentary is trying to do. It's trying to distort and twist the record of Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly, if you go back and look at the debates, they're all on YouTube, for example, and on the internet in various places. There's a site called Schlafly's Eagles, Phyllis Schlafly Eagles, and her organization was called the Eagle Forum. And there are websites where they have these videos up. YouTube is probably the easiest one. You just type in the name Phyllis Schlafly, and you can see all of her debates and all of her appearances on, like, for example, Phil Donahue. She appeared on Phil Donahue quite a bit and was able to, in simple terms, explain why the Equal Rights Amendment, so-called Equal Rights Amendment, would be harmful for women. Now, this is important because you don't have anyone, for example, of the caliber of a Phyllis Schlafly today explaining the dangers of the feminist movement. Phyllis Schlafly, for example, explained that if you're going to give an across-the-board equal rights, no difference between men and no difference between women, and if you're going to consistently make that the law of the land, then you're going to be drafting women for military. And she didn't want women and girls drafted for military service. She thought it was fine if they wanted to sign up voluntarily and if they wanted to have some kind of career in the military, that would be fine. But to be drafted would be the natural correlation for this ERA. And there's no question about it that women in a time of war would be drafted under this ERA legislation because that is what equality would stand for. And there were all kinds of other additional aspects of the ERA. For example, the feminist movement that was pushing the ERA was also pushing heavily the LGBTQ movement. And it wasn't nearly as strong as it became, the LGBTQ movement became in the last 30 years, culminating in this Obergefell decision in 2015. But the feminists were all on board for the whole LGBTQ agenda. Now, there was some infighting in the feminist movement as to whether they would embrace the lesbian aspects of it and all this thing because they didn't think the American public would go for that. But in the end, they actually did promote all that. And then, of course, abortion was the big item on the agenda of the feminist movement and the ERA push. They wanted women to get state-funded abortions. They wanted no restrictions on abortions. They wanted a woman's absolute and total right to an abortion at any stage of development, funded fully by the U.S. government. And again, Phyllis Schlafly and the women that she motivated to defeat the ERA, they opposed abortion. They opposed the LGBTQ cause. So in other words, Phyllis Schlafly was one of the key founders of what is now called the pro-family movement. And that is why the feminists hated her so much, because she exposed the feminist agenda. Basically, the feminist agenda was aimed at destroying the traditional Judeo-Christian model of marriage and family and male-female roles in society. It wanted to destroy all of that. It's as destructive as anything can be. Most of the women who were the leaders of the feminist movement back then opposed the Judeo-Christian ethic and moral standards. And it does show in the documentary some of the personal and private lives of the feminists. Now, it showcases the life of Phyllis Schlafly, mostly in a negative way, but it does showcase her life. But then it also has episodes on each of the other influential women in the battle for ERA and the feminists. So, for example, it shows the life of Gloria Steinem and how her sexually promiscuous lifestyle. It shows another woman, the feminist lawyer that Schlafly actually defeated in debate, although the miniseries shows her losing to this woman in a distortion. But this woman was having a lesbian affair on the side, all the while married to a man who is also a feminist. And there were some men, quite a few men, who were actually on the feminist cause and promoting it. And in fact, at the time, the President of the United States and his wife, Gerald Ford and Betty Ford, they were all on board for the ERA. They were all feminists. A majority of senators voted for the ERA in the Senate, and a majority in the House voted for the ratification of the ERA. So you had basically everyone in power in Washington in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, even though they had not fully explored all the implications of it, and they didn't like Phyllis Schlafly and her talking against it, and they opposed her. Even with basically the bastion of power in the United States in Washington for the ERA, Phyllis Schlafly was able to mobilize and organize just thousands and thousands, even millions and millions of women across the country to defeat this. And what they had to do was to make sure that the amendment to the Constitution never got the 2/3 majority of states. And they were being defeated at almost every turn, but in the end, they were able to keep the certain states that would tip the ERA amendment over the top out of ERA category and into the opposition category. And so they actually prevented the ERA from being ratified. We don't have it as a constitutional amendment. And it's a really good thing that we don't have it. And we need to be praying that we don't get it, because even though the name, and that was part of the propaganda of the whole feminist movement, the name Equal Rights Amendment. It was a propaganda tool crafted to try to get people on board with this sort of egalitarian, kind of a socialistic mentality where men and women would be treated as if there were no distinct sexual differences. And this has been the basic thrust of the radical left for the last 50 years, trying to break down the categories of male and female. And it's no surprise that the feminist leaders were all anti-family. They were all anti-marriage. They were all anti-traditional roles for women in the home, raising children, etc. That really bothered them. They wanted to basically blow that whole system up. And Phyllis Schlafly was able to mobilize women, and it was mostly women that she mobilized, because women began to see, at least the typical average woman began to see, wait, we don't want to be out there competing against men head to head in every category. We appreciate the fact that in many important and key ways, we are given a privileged status on certain things because of the ability of men to protect and preserve family, and women are primarily there to nurture the children and to hold the family together. And we want the family structure to hold together, and we want everything that can happen to promote family, and we don't want the family to dissolve. We don't want the family structure in society to be dismantled by the feminist ideology. If you look back in the writings of Karl Marx, the original communist philosopher, and Engels, right in their Communist Manifesto, many of the ideas that the feminists were espousing back during this ERA battle is exactly what Marx was writing about. And these are revolutionaries. They wanted to bring about a revolution in the society. And feminist ideology has always been about revolution. Now, there are certain things in the feminist ideology or feminist cause that are positive and help remind people to not neglect certain things about, for example, equal pay for equal work. No problem. But the thing is that in order to accomplish some of these minor victories, they're wanting to dismantle major pillars of culture and society, like marriage, like family, like the roles between men and women. And feminists hate it when the differences between male and female are pointed out. For example, we have a controversy today where there are boys in Connecticut running track in high school in the women's division and are beating all the women in the women's track meets. How are these boys allowed to run against women? Because they, quote, identify as women. That's it. And you know what? The feminist of today and the radical leftists and the Democratic Party is all on board with these boys robbing women of their own events in track and taking all the medals home. It shows you that it isn't in the best interest for women to embrace the radical feminist agenda. And it wasn't in the women's best interest to embrace the ERA because it would impose upon them responsibilities that go far beyond what women have traditionally wanted to embrace. I mean, what women want to go into military service, what women want to be drafted, what women want to be thrust into a competition, winner take all against men. I think most women, and Phyllis Schlafly tapped into this, most women do not want to be in direct competition with men for money, for work, and all other aspects. They want to be treated different. They want to be put in a different category. They want to have a position of privilege, but not necessarily equality in all areas, because if you put it equality in all areas, just like the transgender athletes at the high school level, some people have said, well, why don't you just put everybody in one category of sports and then have high schools just have a track meet for everyone? And that's, you would think, okay, well, that's part of the Equal Rights Amendment. You know, we have to have women treated the same as men. So you just throw all the athletes together and they're running around the track. And guess who's going to win all of the track and field events? The boys. Why? Because there are differences between boys and girls. And so what starts out as an argument for equality, hey, we have to make it an equal and level playing field. We're going to put the boys and girls all together in the track meets. There's not a boys division. There's not a girls division. It's just high school athletes, period. Equality, right? No. In that instance, women are effectively shut out of winning because the boys take all the prizes at the unisex sporting event. And that's a lot like the ERA. The ERA says, oh, well, let's make everything equal. Let's level the playing field in all respects. Phyllis Schlafly and the women that she led said, no, we understand what happens when you do that because women don't benefit. It actually hurts women in the long term. The short term, it sounds great. You know, it has a lot of appeal. It's catchy. But when you think out the implications of it, it actually harms women. So Phyllis Schlafly was a great woman. She died this past year. She's written a number of really powerful books in respect to the pro-family movement. And her mind was sharp. I heard her on an interview, a radio interview with James Dobson, and it was only 2 or 3 years ago. And she was still writing books, still speaking, still conversing, and still making the strong arguments that she made. So one of the benefits of this docudrama is that people are going to scratch their head and go, I've never heard of Phyllis Schlafly. Who is this woman that all of these other feminists are against? And who is this woman that is the star of this docuseries? Why haven't I ever heard of her? I think one of the benefits of this series is it's going to get people looking into the writings and the speeches and the debates of Phyllis Schlafly. And when they do, they're going to be exposed to really solid content. You know, a lot of the feminists, like a Gloria Steinem, her arguments are very emotional laden. They're all sort of surface level, stereotypical radical feminist talking points, much like, for example, the radical left is today, and Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, and a lot of their content is just more emotive, kind of surface level talking points that push buttons in the right demographic. That is not what Phyllis Schlafly was all about. She actually made arguments, and she had studied, and she was educated, and she was articulate, and she was great in debate because she could make comebacks and counter arguments. And in fact, a lot of the feminist authors and speakers at the time didn't want to really engage with her one-to-one in debate, and it showed that in the docuseries. Another fabrication of the docuseries was that at one point Phyllis Schlafly was afraid to debate Bella Abzug at one university, I think, and that is totally false. She never backed away from a debate. She always accepted whenever she could, unless there was a conflict of scheduling. But she was on TV a lot, Phil Donahue a lot. I remember way back there seeing her. I think it's very foggy. It's 40 years ago. She spoke, she wrote, she lectured. I mean, this woman almost single-handedly, with the help of the women that she recruited, defeated something that the power senators and congressmen and presidents were all against her, and she defeated a really bad piece of legislation, which we have to thank the Lord that she did. So definitely, if you have a chance, get a chance to see. It's called Mrs. America. It's heavily distorted. It's definitely a feminist hit piece on Phyllis Schlafly, but I think, and it would get you interested enough to look further into it and really dig up what really happened and listen to her debates, listen to her talks, and you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot. And you'll learn a alternative way of looking at things rather than the mainstream media that pumping out the feminist agenda today. So hope you go see that, and we'll see you back next week on another program. God bless.